In this story, a husband named James finds himself trapped in a whirlwind of confusion and heartbreak after discovering that his wife, Ketty, has been having an affair with their personal driver, Walker. James begins to notice something strange in his wife's behavior. She's been avoiding him more often and seems indifferent. One afternoon, James comes home early and finds Ketty and Walker in their bedroom, displaying an unusual closeness. Shocked and angry, James listens to Ketty's explanation, where she reveals her long-hidden feelings, feeling lonely and neglected in their marriage. The affair not only physically wounds James but also shatters his respect for his wife and trust in Walker. Though his heart is broken, James realizes that he must choose how to move forward after the betrayal that has destroyed everything they once built together. This story portrays the emotional journey of a man struggling to accept the painful truth and seeking a way to heal himself. That morning, James sat at the dining table, staring at a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The clock on the wall read 7 a.m., yet Ketty, his wife, had not yet come out of their bedroom. This had been happening for the past few days, and James began to feel that something was off. Normally, Ketty would wake up early and be busy preparing breakfast. But now, the atmosphere in the house felt different. Ketty seemed to speak less and often avoided long conversations with James. Is she dealing with something? James thought, trying to find a rational explanation for his wife's change in behavior. Yet deep inside, he felt that something was wrong. A sense of unease he couldn't quite explain. It felt like something was being hidden, and James tried to reassure himself not to be overly suspicious. Ketty still hadn't come out, while James had been waiting at the dining table. Occasionally, he checked his phone, hoping to hear from his wife, but there were no messages. Everything felt silent. An unusual silence. James's thoughts kept spinning, wondering if there was more to it than just work-related stress that might be weighing on Ketty. Was she tired of their life together? Or was there something she wasn't willing to reveal? Suddenly, the sound of footsteps from upstairs broke the silence. James lifted his head, hoping it was Ketty finally coming down. However, what he saw was their personal driver, Walker, coming down the stairs with a worried expression. James furrowed his brow. Why is Walker here? He thought, his confusion growing deeper. Walker walked toward the living room, and James sensed something strange in the way the man carried himself. Normally, Walker was friendly and confident. But today, there was something different in the way he moved, as if avoiding James's gaze. After a while, James decided to go to Ketty's room. He felt increasingly unsettled by the uncertainty hanging over their relationship. That afternoon, James decided to leave work early. In the past few weeks, he had begun to feel an increasing distance between himself and Ketty. Their respective careers were taking up a lot of time, but James felt that this was not enough of an explanation for the decline in communication between them. With quick steps, James entered the house and walked toward their bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and he heard a familiar sound of laughter coming from inside. James leaned closer to the door, trying to make out who was speaking. The voice, it was Ketty's. But there was another voice accompanying it, a male voice that was unfamiliar to James. Walker. James froze in front of the door, gripping the doorknob with a slightly trembling hand. An uneasy feeling began to creep into his chest. Cautiously, he opened the door slowly, and what he saw almost made his body collapse. Ketty was sitting on the bed, wearing clothes that were out of the ordinary. Walker was sitting next to her, looking very familiar with her. They were laughing together, as if the world around them didn't exist. James felt his chest tighten. Anger, confusion, and pain surged deeply inside him, like an unavoidable shock. Ketty looked toward the door, and her face turned pale as she realized James's presence. Walker turned around too, his face instantly showing panic. Ketty looked confused, but there was no regret in her eyes, only a vacant stare directed at James. James stood at the doorframe, unsure of what to do. Everything they had built, all the trust that existed, was shattered in an instant. Why, Ketty? James said with a strained voice. Why is he here? Ketty lowered her head, looking deeply hurt and confused about what to say. No words came from her lips. Walker stood still, not daring to meet James's gaze any longer. "I'm sorry, James." Ketty's voice finally came out, soft but full of regret. I don't know where to begin." James looked at his wife, disappointment and heartbreak clearly etched on his face. "Why now?" James asked in a barely audible tone. "I felt lonely, James," Ketty answered softly, her eyes looking empty. "Walker was there when I felt neglected." That statement hurt more than James could have imagined. All the hope he had was shattered. Now there was only an empty space between them. Silent. Heavy. Nothing could restore everything to how it was before. James stood frozen in front of Ketty, feeling like the world was collapsing around him. Every word that came out of his wife's mouth deepened the wound that was already there. His heart was shattered, but for some reason, there was something within him that made it impossible to leave just yet. The pain was so deep, but there were two main reasons why James could still hold on. Their young children, who still needed love and attention from both parents, and the promise they had made to each other to be together forever. "James, I'm sorry. I know I'm wrong. I don't know what to do. But I've felt so pressured and neglected," Ketty said with a voice that was almost breaking. Her eyes were red, and her face looked exhausted, as if she had been carrying a heavy burden for months. James lowered his head, thinking about their young children, who were still very small and needed their love and care. The two of them, despite their brokenness, still had a huge responsibility. Not just toward each other, but also toward the future of their two innocent children, who had no idea what was happening. I can't just let everything end like this," James said slowly, gasping for breath. "But, Ketty, I also can't forgive all of this without change. I'm not just disappointed in you. I'm disappointed in myself for not seeing you more clearly. We've drifted apart, so far apart." Ketty could only remain silent, looking at James with eyes full of regret. She knew exactly what she had done, and no words could truly make up for it. But she didn't want to lose James just like that. This decision would change everything. But did that mean the end for the two of them? "If only I could do it all over again," Ketty murmured. "I would fix everything, James. I'll try to be a better wife. Please give me a second chance." James closed his eyes for a moment, the feelings coming so fast, disappointment, heartbreak, but also deep love for his wife. He wanted to end it all, to let Ketty go, and save himself from this pain. But then, the sound of their children's innocent laughter echoed in his mind. Two innocent faces that always needed both of them. "The children, they need us," James said in a calmer voice. "We can't just end this, Ketty. I can't forgive you just like that, but I can't leave our children. They're not at fault." Ketty looked at James with the hope still lingering in her eyes. "I will change, James. I promise I won't do it again. I know I've hurt you, but please let me prove that I can be a better wife and mother." James felt the heavy burden in his heart. Forgiving Ketty wouldn't be easy, and maybe the pain would remain for a long time. But for their children, for their family, James decided to give her a chance. However, that chance wasn't without conditions. If Ketty wanted to continue this relationship, she had to fight hard to earn James's trust again. There was no easy way, and James knew that. "I'm giving this chance not because I've forgiven you," James said with a heavy voice, "but because our children need their mother, and I don't want them to grow up without both of their parents by their side." Ketty's tears fell, and with deep regret, she said, "I will do anything to earn your trust again, James." James looked at her with eyes full of emotion, but behind that, there was a glimmer of hope. They didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain. Their journey together wasn't over yet. The days passed after the conversation that changed everything. James tried to suppress the deep pain in his heart. Although he had forgiven Ketty, the trust that had been broken couldn't be rebuilt overnight. Every time he looked at his wife, James felt as if there was an invisible distance stretching between them. That morning, James woke up earlier than usual. The sound of their children playing in the living room echoed softly in his ears. They laughed joyfully, unaware that their parents' world had just been shattered. James slowly walked to the living room, watching his son and daughter busy with their toys. Behind the laughter and joy of the children, James realized the huge responsibility he carried. He had to keep this family together, even though his heart was broken. The children needed stability, and that was something he couldn't ignore. "Good morning, darling," said Ketty, who suddenly appeared at the doorway with a smile that seemed more sincere than usual. James just nodded without saying anything. His smile felt forced, although he didn't want to show his disappointment. He was still trying to calm himself, trying to accept the reality that their lives were now different. Ketty walked closer, trying to speak more gently. "I know I need to improve a lot. I won't be able to fix everything overnight, but I promise I will try harder. For you and the kids." James felt a heavy weight on his chest. Every word that came from Ketty reminded him of the betrayal that would never fully fade. However, he also realized that if he continued to hold on to resentment, not only Ketty would suffer, his children would feel the impact as well. "Let's try, Ketty," James said finally, his voice softer than he expected. "But I need time. This isn't easy for me, and I want to see you try. We need to work together for our family. Our children need both of us." Ketty nodded with full understanding. She knew this was a very valuable opportunity, and she couldn't disappoint James again. However, despite their efforts to start over, there were so many challenges to face. James's trust couldn't be restored just like that, and Ketty had to prove that she was truly ready to change. Every small action Ketty took, every effort she made to show her commitment, became a tough test for both of them. Day by day, Ketty tried to show improvement. She spent more time with the children, making sure they felt loved and cared for. However, James still sensed an unspoken tension. Every time Ketty smiled or tried to get closer, James felt like something was missing, as if that smile wasn't entirely sincere. One evening, as James sat at the dinner table with the children, Ketty sat beside him and touched his hand. "I know this is difficult. I know you're still struggling to trust me. But I want you to know, James, I won't give up. I want us to start again, slowly, bit by bit. I will wait, if that's what you need." James sighed deeply. Doubt and fear began to creep into his heart again. He was afraid that all of this was just an illusion. He feared that Ketty's efforts wouldn't be enough to fix what had been broken. But on the other hand, he knew he couldn't stay trapped in the past. If they wanted to rebuild their relationship, they had to fight together. "Nothing happens instantly, Ketty. Everything takes time. And we need to fight together. If I can see your sincere efforts, maybe I can start trusting you again. But it won't be easy." Ketty nodded slowly. "I know, James. I'm ready. I will prove it." However, their journey was still long. Every day was a struggle, and James knew that, even though they had taken a new step, many obstacles would come. The trust that had been lost had to be rebuilt from the ground up. The days full of challenges began to give James a small sense of peace. Ketty worked hard to repair their relationship, and although the trust was still fragile, James began to notice positive changes. The children were growing happier with the presence of both parents starting to come together again. James felt that perhaps this was the best for them, to give their marriage a chance. However, as life started to smooth out, James received a job offer that required him to be away for a few days. This job was very important, and James knew this was an opportunity to prove his capabilities in his field. But behind his busyness, James started to feel anxious. The trust that had been slowly recovering was now being tested by troubling thoughts. He knew that Walker, their personal driver, was still around the house, and although James wanted to trust his wife, there was one thing he couldn't forget. Walker was the same man who had played a large part in destroying his marriage. Although they had never directly spoken about it, James felt that tension still lingered. He didn't want to leave Ketty alone with Walker, especially after everything that had happened. James thought for a moment. He knew that if he went alone, it was highly likely that Walker would get close to Ketty again, maybe not with good intentions. After thinking for a while, James decided to bring Walker along on this business trip. The only way for him to feel at ease was to ensure that Walker wasn't close to Ketty, at least for the next few days. With this decision, James called Walker to the living room. "Walker, I'll be going out of town for a few days for work. I want you to come with me. I need you to make sure everything goes smoothly," James said with a tone more assertive than usual. Walker looked surprised but quickly nodded in agreement. Of course, Mr. James. I'm ready. James looked at Walker closely. He knew that this was his way of ensuring that the relationship between Ketty and their personal driver wouldn't repeat. He couldn't just trust everything to Ketty, even though she had promised to change. The next day, James, Walker, and a colleague from James's company set off for the city where James was required to work. The journey felt long, and despite being busy with work, James's heart remained uneasy. Every time he looked at Walker, James felt cautious, as if there was something unresolved between them. In the car, speeding down the highway, James noticed Walker sitting beside him, appearing more relaxed than before. Walker only spoke occasionally, mostly listening when James discussed work. But James felt that there was something unsaid between them, a tension that neither of them could shake off. During the journey, James began to recall every event that had shattered his heart. It all felt so real, as if it had happened just yesterday. Walker, who he had once trusted as part of their family, had now become a source of tension in his heart. James tried hard not to think about it, but the shadow of betrayal constantly haunted every step he took. Several times, James glanced at Walker, who sat calmly, apparently feeling no discomfort at all. Perhaps he had grown used to this kind of atmosphere. But for James, every passing second in the car felt filled with pressure. That evening, they arrived at the hotel where James would stay for the next few days. After handling some work-related matters, James returned to his room, feeling both physically and emotionally drained. Walker, who usually went home after working hours, was also staying at the same hotel. As they all sat in the hotel dining room, the atmosphere still felt awkward. Ketty and their children had no idea what was happening, and James tried to calm himself by thinking that this was all for the good of their family. He didn't want to make the situation worse. However, every time James looked at Walker, the anxious feeling resurfaced. James knew that this trip was part of a much larger test. He had to maintain his balance, try to trust Ketty, but with a heart still wounded. Walker remained by his side, and James couldn't help but wonder whether this decision was truly helping, or if it was only making things worse. James and Walker's trip out of town went smoothly, but despite the days being filled with meetings and work, James couldn't shake off the growing frustration gnawing at his thoughts. With each passing moment, that feeling grew stronger, deeper. He realized that no matter how hard he tried to rebuild his life, there was one thing that couldn't be ignored: Walker. The driver, who now sat beside him, once trusted and part of their family routine, had now become the greatest reminder of the wound he had felt. The broken trust, the betrayal that could never truly be erased. Walker was part of a past that could never be forgotten. James looked at Walker, who was focused on the road, his eyes seemingly normal, as if nothing had changed. But for James, the feelings remained, the buried anger. Even after everything that had happened, Walker still sat beside him as though nothing was wrong, as if the betrayal had never occurred. Every time James looked at him, his heart felt the same emotions: frustration, disappointment, and betrayal. That morning, James made a decision. This would be Walker's last trip. There was no longer any reason to keep him around. Walker had to go, and James knew this was a decision he should have made a long time ago. This was James's way of closing the wound that had been festering in his heart. After the work meeting ended, James called Walker to a small room in the hotel where they were staying. Walker entered with his usual calm steps. James sat in a chair, looking at him with sharp eyes. "Walker, I want to talk to you," James said, his voice firmer than he expected. Walker nodded, as if he had anticipated this would happen. "Is there something I can help you with, Mr. James?" Walker asked, his tone showing no sign of worry, as if he didn't feel anything was wrong. James took a deep breath, trying to calm his chaotic thoughts. "I've decided to fire you, Walker. You will no longer work at our house starting today." Walker paused for a moment, as if he couldn't believe what James was saying. His eyes widened, but he didn't speak. There was a profound silence between them. Walker knew the reason behind this decision, even though James didn't need to explain further. The betrayal was too great to forgive, and James could no longer live with these feelings. What is the exact reason for this decision, Mr. James?" Walker asked, his voice slightly anxious, though he tried to stay calm. Your reason is clear, Walker, James replied flatly. You crossed a line I can't tolerate. I can no longer allow you to work at our house. This is the final decision. Walker lowered his head, not daring to look at James. All right, Mr. James. I understand. James felt a slight sense of relief after saying those words, though his heart was still heavy. This decision wasn't easy, but he knew it was the right step. There was no place for a betrayer in his life, and James felt that this was the way to truly close the painful chapter in his life. After what felt like a long few seconds, James said, You can go back home and take your things. Starting today, you will no longer work with us. Walker nodded and walked out of the room without saying anything. James remained seated in his chair, staring at the door that had just been closed. It felt like, even though this was the right decision, there was something still bothering him deep down. But he knew this was the step that had to be taken. The betrayal would never truly be forgotten, and James needed to move forward, even with the lingering pain. That trip was Walker's last career with them. And for James, it was the first step in healing, even though the road ahead was still full of challenges. After the difficult decision, James began his journey home alone. There was no Walker in the seat beside him, no casual conversation or laughter that usually filled their long journeys. The car speeding down the highway felt empty, with only the repetitive hum of the engine haunting the eerie silence. For years, Walker had always been there, beside him, a part of every trip, of every daily routine that seemed inseparable. But now, James felt as though there was an empty space that no one could fill. Walker was not just a driver. He had once been someone close to their family, someone James had trusted. But now, all that had changed. The trust that once existed was shattered in an instant. James stared out the window, watching the scenery blur by. He felt as though he was driving toward an uncertain place, much like his life now, drifting. The journey home felt longer than usual. His heart felt empty, even though he knew that the decision he had made was the right one. As the car pulled into the driveway, James felt a different kind of tension. The house looked the same as it had when he left a few days ago, calm, quiet, but there seemed to be something missing. Normally, when he came home, Walker would open the door and greet him with a smile. But this time, there was no sound of footsteps or warm greeting from the driver who had long served their family. James stopped in front of the house, staring at the entrance. He took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, walking slowly into the house. Each step felt heavy, as if he were walking through memories that were hard to forget. Inside, Ketty greeted him with a small smile. Her face seemed calmer, but James could see a hint of concern in her eyes. Perhaps Ketty sensed that James had not fully recovered from the wounds that had been inflicted. "What's wrong, James? You look tired," Ketty asked gently, trying to start a conversation. James simply nodded slightly. "I just got back. Walker is no longer here." Ketty paused for a moment, as if trying to process James's words. Her face looked a little surprised, but she didn't ask further questions. Ketty already knew exactly why Walker no longer worked with them. She also knew that even though James had forgiven her, there was much that still needed to be repaired. "So, you decided to fire him?" Ketty asked carefully, seeking confirmation. James nodded, removing his jacket and placing it on the chair near the door. "I couldn't keep living with these feelings, Ketty. I tried to hold on, but I couldn't turn a blind eye to the truth. The betrayal was too big." Ketty let out a sigh, and James could see regret in her eyes. "I understand, James. I know why you had to make that decision. But do you feel better now?" James looked at Ketty for a moment, trying to digest her question. "I don't know, Ketty. I just feel empty. Walker had been a part of this family for so long, and now he's gone. I feel lonely, even though I know I made the right decision." Ketty approached and gently touched James's hand. "I'm here, James. We'll get through this together. It might not be easy, but I promise I will try to be the best for us, for the kids." James nodded, though his heart still felt heavy. He knew that this journey was far from over. Even though Walker was no longer in their home, There were many things to face in order to rebuild the trust and happiness that had been lost. However, one thing James knew for sure: this was the first step toward change, even though it was a step filled with uncertainty. As night fell, James sat in the living room, reflecting on everything that had happened. He thought about the children, who were asleep, hoping that the decision he had made would bring good for them. Though his heart was still hurting, he knew that only with time and effort would the wound heal. For now, James chose to embrace the peace of the empty house, even though many shadows from the past still haunted him. He would continue to move forward, even though the road ahead seemed full of obstacles. That night, after James sat alone in the living room, Ketty felt that something was weighing heavily on her heart. Since James's return from his trip, she noticed that her husband seemed calmer, but there was no happiness on his face. Even when she tried to talk to him, James still looked like someone who had lost his spirit. Ketty knew that her decision to forgive and continue their relationship wasn't something that could be easily obtained. While she felt given a chance to fix things, she also sensed that something was missing, something she couldn't express. In their bedroom, Ketty sat on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the wall. It was hard to sleep that night, even though her body was tired. Disappointment, anger, and anxiety swirled in her mind. It felt like a weight was pressing down on her chest. She felt like she was at a crossroads, unsure of which way to choose. "Why do I feel so empty?" Ketty murmured to herself. She had tried to be a better wife, but there were feelings she couldn't share with James, feelings of disappointment that she had never had the chance to talk about. Every time she looked at James, she knew her husband was trying to come to terms with the reality, trying to accept the betrayal that had occurred between them. However, even though James was trying to move forward in their relationship, Ketty felt like there was an increasing distance between them. Ketty couldn't express her disappointment to James. She felt ashamed, guilty, and afraid that if she revealed these feelings, James would only distance himself further. Perhaps James thought he needed to keep trying, even though his heart was still hurting. But Ketty knew that she also had to protect James's feelings. Nothing could change their past, and if she expressed these feelings now, would it destroy what they had tried to rebuild? Chapter 10. The Inability to Express. Early in the morning, Ketty woke up and walked to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. James was still asleep, and the atmosphere in the house felt calmer than the night before. The children were sound asleep in their rooms, and Ketty took advantage of the morning to reflect on the lingering emotions within her. In the kitchen, as Ketty prepared breakfast, her mind drifted back to their conversation a few days ago, when James had decided to fire Walker. The decision had been swift, and although she knew it was the right one, Ketty couldn't suppress the disappointment that came so suddenly. Not only toward James, but also toward herself. She felt as if she had let her husband down, and now, even though they were trying to move forward, there were feelings that remained unspoken. James came home earlier that day. When he entered the kitchen, Ketty was preparing breakfast for them. James gave a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Ketty knew it wasn't because James didn't care, but because of the complicated emotions inside both of them. "Good morning, Ketty. Thanks for preparing breakfast," James said, his voice still sounding flat, although he tried to sound cheerful. Ketty simply nodded, then served the food on the dining table. She wanted to say something, perhaps about the feelings weighing on her, about how she felt trapped in this tense situation. But every time the words came to her lips, Ketty held them back. She didn't want to hurt James any further. Ketty remembered the moments when she first felt a bond with James. They had shared so much together, filled with laughter and happiness. But now something had changed. Every conversation between them felt full of tension, and although they tried to return to normal, Ketty felt that normality was no longer the same. The trust that had been broken could never be restored so quickly. James sat at the dining table, facing Ketty. He tried to smile, but it felt so forced. Ketty saw it, and her heart grew heavier. She wanted to tell James how she felt alienated, how she too felt hurt, not only because of the betrayal but also because she felt like she could no longer be herself in front of her husband. Yet, the words remained silent on her lips. Ketty felt too afraid to express all of it, knowing that by voicing her disappointment and pain, it would only make everything more complicated. She chose to remain silent, hoping that someday James would understand that more than just an apology was needed to heal their relationship. That day, James felt increasingly distant at home. Although Ketty was trying to fix everything, there was something he couldn't avoid: the growing tension between them. Every conversation felt like there was a wall separating them, and James became more uncomfortable. Ketty, despite her efforts to be a better wife, still couldn't express the deep disappointment she felt toward him, and James didn't know how to fix the situation. This feeling continued to gnaw at James, and finally, one night, he decided to leave the house. He didn't want to argue or talk more with Ketty. His heart was still hurt, and he felt increasingly uncomfortable at home. His decision to leave that late night was driven by an overwhelming need to escape the tension that hung between them. After a quiet dinner, James left the house without informing Ketty. He didn't want to make the situation worse, but he also felt the need to step away for a while and find peace. He didn't know where to go, but his feet took him to the office. James felt calmer when he was in a familiar place, the place where he could work and escape from his personal issues. At 10 p.m., James was still in his office, finishing up some piling work. The dim office lights created a quiet atmosphere, which actually made James feel more comfortable. He sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen without truly paying attention to it. His thoughts wandered far away, back to Ketty, the children, and the decisions he had to make. All of it weighed on him, and James felt increasingly trapped in his confusion. Suddenly, footsteps were heard from the office door. James turned and saw Selena, the company's treasurer, whom he had known for a long time. Selena looked hesitant but still approached with a somewhat awkward smile. James was surprised to see her, as he hadn't expected anyone else to be in the office at this hour. "Good evening, James," Selena said softly, though she seemed a little nervous. "Still working?" James gave a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, still a few things to finish," he replied quietly. "What about you? Why are you still here?" Selena nodded, looking a little awkward, but she still stood in front of James's desk. "I also have some work left to do, but to be honest, I wanted to talk to you for a moment." James raised an eyebrow, a little surprised, but he gestured for Selena to sit. "Sure. Is there something you want to talk about?" Selena sat in the chair across from James, her eyes fixed on him with a meaningful glance. She clearly felt uneasy, but there was something inside her that made her feel the need to speak. "James, actually, I've wanted to tell you something for a while," Selena said, her voice growing quieter. "I know you're married, and I don't want to interfere with your personal life, but I feel I need to say this." James stared at Selena with a confused look. He sensed there was something unusual about the way she was speaking, and his heart felt uncertain about where this conversation was headed. "What do you mean, Selena?" James asked, trying to understand better. Selena took a deep breath, her gaze lowering slightly, as if unsure of the words she was about to say. "I've admired you for a long time, James," Selena continued, her voice becoming more assertive. "Not just because we work together, but also because I see you as someone perfect. I know you're married, and I don't want to interfere with your relationship. But I have to be honest, I can't hide these feelings anymore." James fell silent upon hearing Selena's words. He didn't know how to respond, and his heart was torn. On one hand, he was deeply shocked and unprepared for such a confession, but on the other hand, a feeling of concern arose. Selena was a good person, hardworking, and always there to help. However, James never imagined that Selena had deeper feelings for him. "Selena, I don't know what to say," James replied, his voice feeling awkward. "I really appreciate you, but I'm married, and I'm dealing with a lot of issues in my marriage right now." Selena lowered her head, trying to hold back the disappointment that slowly crept into her heart. "I know, James. I just felt like I had to say this, so that I don't regret it later." James felt trapped between shock and empathy for Selena. He knew that Selena didn't want to cause trouble in his life, but this confession brought a much bigger complication than James had anticipated. In this situation, full of confusion and tension, Selena's feelings became yet another challenge he had to face. That evening, as light rain began to fall outside the office window, the sound of raindrops hitting the glass created a calm, yet tense atmosphere. James stared out the window, watching the empty road, his mind still filled with the problems weighing on his heart. Since his return to the office that evening, the uneasy feeling hadn't left him. He felt torn between wanting to go home or staying in a place that could give him a little space to think. Beside him, Selena sat quietly, occasionally glancing at James, waiting for the right moment to speak further. They had known each other for a long time, although their relationship had always been that of colleagues. However, tonight, something felt different. The quietness of the evening and the rain adding to the silence gave them a space to speak more freely, as if the world outside their office had come to a standstill. James sighed deeply. "I feel trapped, Selena," James said, his voice sounding tired and full of confusion. "Everything that's been happening lately, I don't know what to do anymore. My marriage, my work, everything feels like it's falling apart. I feel more and more distant from Ketty, and I don't even know if I can fix this." Selena watched James carefully. She could see how heavy the burden on him was, even though he tried to remain strong. The rain outside intensified the atmosphere, and Selena knew this was the right moment to listen more. Without saying anything, Selena just nodded, giving James space to continue. "Ketty, she's trying, I know that," James continued quietly. "But I can't stop feeling disappointed, Selena. Everything that's happened, that betrayal, how can I forget all of it? I've tried to forgive, but my heart still can't accept the reality of it." James looked down, staring at his hands folded on the table. Every word that left his mouth felt like a heavier burden. "I wish things could go back to how they were, when everything seemed easy. But the truth is, I can't ignore these feelings. I don't know whether to continue this marriage or what to do." Selena didn't respond immediately. She knew this was a huge issue, and she couldn't solve all the emotions James was feeling in just one conversation. But she felt it was necessary to give James the space to speak, to listen to his feelings without judgment. "Sometimes, we can't control what happens in our lives, James," Selena said softly. "Sometimes, the feelings we try to hide only end up destroying us. Maybe you need to give yourself time to really absorb what you're feeling before making a big decision." James lifted his face, looking at Selena with tired eyes. "I've given myself time, Selena, but time doesn't heal everything. I feel more and more distant. Ketty, the kids, everything feels like a burden. I know it's wrong, but I don't know how to face it." The atmosphere around them grew quieter, the rain intensifying outside, as if reflecting the tension within James. Selena felt that this was the moment when James truly needed someone to listen. Without realizing it, they both started to open up more, speaking more about the issues that had been buried in their hearts. "Those feelings, James," Selena said, her voice now more empathetic. "Sometimes we feel torn between doing what's right and following our feelings. But remember, your feelings are important. You can't just ignore what you're feeling." James nodded, though he still seemed confused. Selena saw the expression on James's face, full of uncertainty. In the stillness of the evening and the rain growing heavier, James felt as if he could be more open, more honest. He felt that talking to Selena brought him a little relief, even though his feelings were so complicated. "I don't know what to do next, Selena," James said again, his voice weaker. "I want to forget everything that's happened, but I can't. I feel lonely even though I have Ketty, even though I have the kids. I feel trapped in a house that should bring comfort, but instead, it hurts." Selena looked at James with deep empathy. "You're not alone, James. You have people around you who care about you, even though sometimes we feel distant from them." James was silent, reflecting on Selena's words. He knew that those feelings wouldn't go away quickly. However, hearing Selena's thoughtful words gave him a little relief in his heart. That evening, they both stayed in the office, talking more, without rushing to leave. James felt a little lighter after the conversation, even though his feelings were still full of doubt. The rain continued to pour, as if giving James time to process all the emotions that had been buried for so long. Meanwhile, Selena remained by his side, listening, without judgment. The night grew later, and the drizzle that had begun earlier turned into a heavy downpour that continued relentlessly. James and Selena sat in the car, driving through the nearly empty streets. Outside, the streetlights reflected the shimmer of the falling rain, creating a scene that looked like a painting. James drove calmly, though his mind was still filled with unease. Selena sat in the passenger seat with a more relaxed demeanor, but James could feel there was still a tension between them, despite their long conversation at the office. Selena, now feeling closer to James, occasionally glanced at him, waiting for the right moment to speak further. They had known each other for quite a while, though their relationship had always been that of coworkers. But tonight, something felt different. The quiet atmosphere and the rain added to the silence, giving them space to speak more freely, as if the world outside their office had stopped turning. James sighed deeply. "I feel like I'm stuck, Selena," James said, his voice sounding tired and full of confusion. "Everything that's happened lately, I don't know what to do anymore. My marriage, my work, everything feels like it's falling apart. I feel more and more distant from Ketty, and I don't even know if I can fix this." Selena watched James closely. She could see how heavy the burden on him was, even though he tried to stay strong. The rain outside made the atmosphere even more intense, and Selena knew this was the right moment to listen. Without saying a word, Selena just nodded, giving James the space to continue. "Ketty, she's trying, I know that," James continued quietly. "But I can't stop feeling disappointed, Selena. Everything that's happened, that betrayal, how can I forget all of it? I've tried to forgive, but my heart still can't accept the reality of it." James looked down, staring at his hands folded on the table. Every word he spoke felt like a heavier burden. "I wish things could go back to the way they were, when everything felt easy. But the truth is, I can't ignore these feelings. I don't know whether to continue this marriage or what to do." Selena didn't respond immediately. She knew this was a huge issue, and she couldn't solve all the emotions James was feeling in just one conversation. But she felt it was important to give James the space to talk, to listen to his feelings without judgment. "Sometimes, we can't control what happens in our lives, James," Selena said softly. "Sometimes, the feelings we try to hide end up destroying us. Maybe you need to give yourself time to really absorb what you're feeling before making a big decision." James lifted his face, looking at Selena with tired eyes. "I've given myself time, Selena. But time doesn't heal everything. I feel more and more distant. Ketty, the kids, everything feels like a burden. I know it's wrong, but I don't know how to face it." The atmosphere around them grew quieter, and the rain outside intensified, as if reflecting the tension inside James. Selena felt that this was the moment when James truly needed someone to listen. Unconsciously, they both started to open up more, speaking more about the issues they had kept hidden in their hearts. "Those feelings, James," Selena said, her voice now more empathetic. "Sometimes we feel torn between doing what's right and following our feelings. But remember, your feelings are important. You can't just ignore what you're feeling." James nodded, though he still seemed confused. Selena saw the expression on his face, full of uncertainty. In the stillness of the evening and the intensifying rain, James felt like he could be more open, more honest. He felt that speaking with Selena gave him a little peace, even though his feelings were so complicated. "I don't know what to do next, Selena," James said again, his voice weaker. "I want to forget everything that's happened, but I can't. I feel lonely even though I have Ketty, even though I have the kids. I feel trapped in a house that should bring comfort, but it just hurts." Selena looked at James with deep empathy. "You're not alone, James. You have people around you who care about you, even though sometimes we feel distant from them." James was silent, reflecting on Selena's words. He knew that those feelings wouldn't go away quickly. However, hearing Selena's thoughtful words gave him a little relief in his heart. That evening, they both stayed in the office, talking more, without rushing to leave. James felt a little lighter after their conversation, even though his feelings were still full of doubt. The rain kept falling, as if giving James time to process all the emotions that had been buried for so long. Meanwhile, Selena stayed by his side, listening without judgment. The next day, James returned to the office with a heavy heart. The events of the previous night were still vivid in his mind. The feelings that arose after talking to Selena felt strange, even more complicated than he had imagined. Although James tried to calm himself, there was an undeniable feeling growing within him, one that he couldn't ignore, despite his attempts to suppress it. The next day at the office, the atmosphere that once felt normal now felt awkward. As James entered his workspace, his eyes met Selena's, who was sitting at her desk, typing something on her computer. Selena glanced at James briefly, then quickly turned her gaze back to her screen. James could feel the tension suddenly rising between them, something unsaid. They both fell silent, but James could sense the discomfort filling the space. He tried to speak, but the words felt heavy on his tongue. This awkward atmosphere had never existed between them before, and James felt as if the world around them stopped for a moment, waiting for the first reaction. "Good morning, Selena." James finally broke the silence, though his voice sounded a bit stiff. "Good morning, James," Selena replied with a faint smile, but their eyes didn't meet. There was a doubt that lingered between them, as if something remained unresolved. James nodded slightly and sat down in his chair, trying to start the day as usual, though his heart felt uneasy. Selena also seemed to be making an effort to focus on her work, but James knew there was something more in her eyes, something that couldn't be hidden. Time passed, and every time James glanced at Selena, an odd feeling emerged, a growing sense of awkwardness. They had always worked together without issue, but now, even though they were only a few desks apart, there was a noticeable distance between them. Every word they spoke felt more calculated, more cautious. At one point, while James was waiting in the office break room, Selena came in to grab a drink. They exchanged glances, and for a moment, both of them fell silent. James felt as though there was something left unsaid, and Selena seemed to feel the same. "Selena, I don't know how to move forward with this," James finally said, struggling to hold back the growing emotions. "That night it wasn't easy, and I feel awkward now." Selena nodded slightly, understanding James's feelings. "I feel the same, James. Maybe we spoke too soon. Maybe we opened up too much that night. I didn't want to make you feel worse. I know you have bigger issues to deal with. So, are we just going to leave this feeling hanging?" James asked, slightly confused, though he knew the answer. I can't just forget about our conversation yesterday. It feels strange, Selena." Selena lowered her head, staring at her drink, then answered in a quieter voice. "I know. I didn't mean to complicate things. I just felt that at that moment I could listen to you. But now I know we need to keep our distance, James. I respect your feelings, and I don't want to be a burden to you." James remained silent, processing Selena's words. A mix of gratitude and guilt filled him. Even though Selena had given him space to speak and open up, their relationship now seemed more difficult, more awkward. "I don't want to change our relationship," James said softly. "We've been working together for a long time, and I don't want this to affect anything." Selena nodded, a faint smile on her face, though it wasn't entirely sincere. "I don't want that either, James. We'll remain friends, just like before." But they both knew that something had changed. The atmosphere in the office would never be the same again. The feelings growing between them were clear, even if unspoken. Maybe they could continue working together as usual, but there would always be an unspoken tension between them. With that conversation, they both realized that, even though they tried to maintain distance, the unspoken feelings would continue to linger, casting a shadow over every step they took. James, despite knowing he still had Ketty at home, couldn't ignore the comfort he felt with Selena that night. Yet, he also knew he had to keep that feeling to himself, because no one could guarantee what would happen next. The atmosphere in the house felt quieter than usual that night. Ketty, after spending the day taking care of the kids and trying to tidy up the house, sat in the living room, waiting for James to come home. The tension that had been lingering between them for so long now felt heavier. Ketty tried to hold back her emotions, attempting to remain calm, even though her heart was haunted by unspoken feelings of anxiety and disappointment. When James finally opened the door, his steps seemed slower than usual. Ketty, who was sitting on the sofa, looked at him, trying to read her husband's expression. There was something different about James, and Ketty could sense it. She could see how James seemed tense, as if there was something very heavy that he wanted to confess. James looked at Ketty for a moment before walking toward the chair across from the sofa. He sat down, and they both stared at each other in a long silence. Ketty waited, although her heart already had a bad feeling. "Ketty, there's something I need to say." James's voice was quiet, but filled with tension. "Something I've been holding back for a long time." Ketty held her breath, looking at James with eyes full of hope, although she already sensed that something was wrong. "What is it, James?" she asked, trying to control her voice so it wouldn't sound anxious. James sighed, looking down at his hands folded in his lap. I've been feeling comfortable with someone at the office," James said, his voice almost inaudible. "Selena, our office treasurer." Ketty froze for a moment, James's words hitting her heart like lightning. The atmosphere in the living room grew even more suffocating, and Ketty could feel her chest tighten. Her heart started beating faster, and for a moment, it felt like the world around her stopped spinning. The anxiety that had been lingering now became a bitter reality. "What do you mean, James?" Ketty finally managed to speak, though her voice sounded like a whisper. Her face showed shock, but there was a deep sadness in her eyes. "So, you feel comfortable with Selena?" Ketty asked again, trying to control herself despite the deep jealousy rising within her. James looked down, feeling extremely guilty. "I didn't mean to hurt you, Ketty, but I have to be honest about my feelings. I feel different with Selena. She listens to me, she gives me space to talk, and I feel more at ease when I'm around her." Ketty felt like a heavy stone had been dropped on her chest. James's words felt so real, like a truth she couldn't avoid. The jealousy, heartache, and regret all mixed together. James, her husband, whom she had fought for, was now revealing this painful truth. "So, you prefer Selena over me?" Ketty's voice was barely audible, filled with emotions that were hard to describe. "Why now, James? Why didn't you talk about this sooner? Why let it go this far?" James felt his heart weighed down by an immense sense of guilt. I didn't want to betray you, Ketty. I just felt confused, lost. But I also didn't want to keep lying to myself. I feel a strong connection with Selena, more than I've felt with you lately." Ketty lowered her head, tears beginning to well up in her eyes, though she tried hard to hold them back. "So, is this how you really feel?" Ketty's voice started to tremble. "After everything we've been through, after everything I've done for us, you choose another woman?" James felt struck, and in that moment, he felt so foolish. "Ketty, I didn't want to hurt you. I don't know what to do anymore. I feel trapped, and now I know I've made a huge mistake." Ketty looked at James, her eyes full of confusion and deep sorrow. "I don't know what to say, James. I feel like I'm not enough for you, even though I've tried. You went looking for comfort elsewhere, and I'm left to fight alone here." James felt shattered seeing Ketty so hurt. He wanted to hug her, apologize, but he knew this wasn't an issue that could be solved so easily. There was a distance now, too far to bridge, and too much had happened. "Ketty, I'm so sorry," James said, his voice full of regret. "I don't know how we got to this point." Ketty shook her head, her face full of tears that began to fall. "You've made your choice, James. Now, I have to think about what's best for me and the kids." The atmosphere in the living room grew more suffocating, and James knew that Ketty's feelings at that moment were a mixture of jealousy, heartache, and loss. The decision James made to be honest had, in fact, created a deep rift between them. James felt like the worst person in the world. He knew he had hurt Ketty more than he could ever imagine. Yet, the feelings he had for Selena, which had grown so deeply, made him feel unable to hold back any longer. But that night, James knew one thing for sure. There was no easy way to heal this wound. Everything had changed, and he had to face the painful reality that their relationship might never return to the way it was. James and Ketty's once happy married life now felt like a distant memory. The atmosphere at home became increasingly tense after James's confession about his feelings for Selena. Ketty, though deeply hurt, tried to accept the reality of it all. However, there was one thing she couldn't escape. The feelings James had been hiding finally came to light in a very real way. That night, after their heavy conversation, James felt even more trapped in an unsolvable dilemma. Though he loved Ketty, there was a feeling that kept disturbing him. Selena, the woman who had been by his side during his difficult times, had now become someone more than just a friend. This feeling was hard to ignore, even though James knew it would hurt Ketty. James looked at Ketty, who was sitting on the sofa, her eyes swollen from crying, making his heart ache even more. "Ketty," James's voice sounded heavy, "I know this isn't fair. I've hurt you, and I can't take back what I said." Ketty stared at him with empty eyes, her tears not yet dry, filling her eyes again. "What do you want, James?" Ketty asked, her voice trembling, as if she had already lost hope. "You've made your choice, haven't you?" James paused for a moment, the growing guilt pressing down on his chest. He knew that what he said next would be a defining moment in their lives. "I can't ignore these feelings, Ketty. I feel trapped. I love you, but I also feel comfortable with Selena." Ketty looked at James with eyes full of confusion and sadness. "So, what do you want, James? What's your choice?" James sighed, trying to speak firmly, though his heart felt torn. "I don't want to lose you, Ketty, but I also can't keep living this lie. So, this is the choice I'm giving you. If you want me to marry Selena and still be your husband, I'll do that. But if you feel this can't be fixed, if you feel you can't accept me anymore, then we can separate. But the kids will stay with me." Those words hit Ketty like thunder in her heart. The jealousy, sadness, and disappointment that had been building up for so long now reached their peak. Ketty never expected James would give her such a choice, a decision that was very difficult and unfair. How could a husband give her such a choice, after all they had been through together? "So, you're giving me the choice between losing you completely or letting you marry someone else?" Ketty's voice was barely audible, but James could feel the intense emotional tremor in it. James nodded slowly, his eyes full of regret. "I know this is so difficult, Ketty. I feel broken too. I don't want to make you suffer, but I can't live in this confusion. I think we need to choose what's best for all of us." Ketty lowered her head, tears falling more freely. She felt as if everything she had built with James over the years had now come crashing down. The love, loyalty, and effort she had given to their marriage now felt meaningless. She felt deeply hurt but also realized that James had given her a choice that she couldn't ignore. "I don't know if I can accept this, James," Ketty said, her voice filled with tears. "I've fought for so long for us, for this family. I don't know what to do anymore. I can't imagine life without you, but I also can't live with this choice." James felt even more torn seeing Ketty so hurt. He wanted to hold her, apologize, but he knew this wasn't an issue that could be solved so easily. There was a distance now too far to bridge, and too much had happened. "Ketty, I'm so sorry," James said, his voice full of regret. "I don't know how we got to this point." Ketty shook her head, her face full of tears that began to fall. "You've made your choice, James. Now, I have to think about what's best for me and the kids." The atmosphere in the living room grew even more suffocating, and James knew that Ketty's feelings at that moment were a mix of jealousy, heartbreak, and loss. The decision James made to be honest had, in fact, created a deep rift between them. James felt like the worst person in the world. He knew he had hurt Ketty more than he could ever imagine. Yet, the feelings he had for Selena, which had grown so deeply, made him feel unable to hold back any longer. But that night, James knew one thing for sure. There was no easy way to heal this wound. Everything had changed, and he had to face the painful reality that their relationship might never return to the way it was. The days after that conversation felt heavy and silent. Ketty tried to process the choice James had given her, but with each passing second, her heart grew more shattered. The decision seemed to haunt her, keeping her awake at night, repeatedly thinking about what she should choose. On one hand, Ketty still loved James, her husband, and wanted to preserve their marriage. But on the other hand, there was a deep jealousy, seeing James so comfortable with Selena, a woman who, despite knowing James was married, seemed to offer the comfort Ketty could no longer provide. Meanwhile, James felt increasingly downcast. He knew that what he had offered Ketty was a very difficult choice, one that would forever change the dynamics of their family. But even though he felt guilty, he also knew that his feelings for Selena could no longer be ignored. That decision still had to be made, even if it hurt the person he loved the most, Ketty. On a quiet afternoon, Ketty decided to speak to James again. She knew this decision would determine the future of their family, and even though her heart was broken, she felt she could no longer hide her feelings. James sat in the living room, staring at the family photo hanging on the wall. Ketty walked into the room slowly, her eyes still red from crying. With a heavy heart, she sat next to James, looking at him with an expression full of emotion. "James," Ketty began, her voice calmer, though sadness flowed through every word. "I've thought long and hard about what you said that night, about the choice you gave me." James turned to look at Ketty, his eyes full of concern. "Ketty, I don't want to force you to make this decision. I know it's very difficult, and I don't want to hurt you further." Ketty smiled faintly, though her smile wasn't entirely sincere. "I know, James. But after thinking and reflecting, I realize there's something I need to admit as well. Maybe I'm not as blameless as I thought." James stared at Ketty in confusion. "What do you mean, Ketty?" Ketty looked down, struggling to express what had been hidden inside her. "I know this may sound unfair, but I've been guilty too, James. I did the same thing as you, with Walker, our former driver. I cheated with him." The words hit James like lightning. Though he was shocked, James also realized that all along, he had thought he was the only one at fault in their relationship. It turned out that Ketty had been carrying the same wound, one that had trapped her in guilt and regret. "What do you mean, Ketty?" James's voice was choked, trying to process everything. "When did this happen? Why didn't you ever tell me?" Ketty took a deep breath, her eyes wet with unshed tears. "It happened a few months before we started having big problems. I felt lonely, James. I felt neglected, and Walker, he was there. I know it was wrong, and I regret it so much. But I could never tell you. I thought it would destroy everything." James stood still for a moment, a mix of emotions flooding him. He felt crushed hearing Ketty's confession, but at the same time, there was a strange sense of relief he couldn't deny. Ketty, whom he had always thought hadn't made any mistakes, had also been holding on to the same disappointment and regret. Ketty continued, her voice growing softer. "I know I can't blame you, James. I know I've hurt you too, and maybe that's what made me decide that I had to let go of part of myself for you. I can't keep living with this feeling." James felt his heart shaken. Ketty, the woman he had always loved and cherished, was now admitting that she too had faltered, had made the same mistake. And even though the jealousy still lingered, James could sense that Ketty was trying to give him a way forward, giving space for James to make the best decision. I don't know what to say, Ketty," James finally said in a voice full of regret. "I'm so sorry, and I know I've made a huge mistake. But if you can accept this, maybe I can try to fix everything." Ketty looked at James, her eyes filled with unspoken emotions. "I'm willing, James. I'm willing if you marry Selena as your second wife. I know you've found comfort with her, and I can't stop that anymore. But I still want to be the first wife, because I want the children to stay with us." James was silent, feeling a mix of emotions in his heart. "Ketty, are you really willing to accept this decision?" Ketty nodded slowly, though tears still fell. "I'm willing, James. I can't keep living in a lie, and I don't want you to feel trapped in this relationship. But I also want the kids to stay with us, and I want you to know that I'll try to accept whatever happens." James couldn't say anything more. Ketty's confession, her willingness, shattered James's heart. He knew that this decision wasn't the best for anyone, but he felt that it was the path that had to be taken, even if it would change everything. That night, James and Ketty sat together in heavy silence, each with a heart full of mixed emotions. Ketty had given James a way forward, though her heart was broken. And James, though feeling guilty and confused, knew that he had to face the bitter truth.